All right, guys. Well, one of the things, some of you may notice, it's Christmas. Let me see here. There's my Christmas tree. My daughter and her family surprised us last night. They came over, climbed up in our attic, got our Christmas stuff down, and helped us put up our tree, which I was really excited about. I'm not a big Christmas guy, but I've really started to enjoy our Christmas decorations over the years, and so it was good to get the tree up. As part of Christmas, what our church has done for a number of years is we have taught the Christmas story. Now, typically, we've taught the story from Luke, which is what we're going to do this week and next week, Luke chapter 2. And then the following week, we'll probably do the Matthew passage, which won't help Flora at all, because it'll probably be way too late for her. But one of the things we've taught our folks is just learn the story. And when you're gathered around the Christmas tree, or just families hanging out on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, say, hey guys, would y'all like to hear the Christmas story? And just share it and ask a couple of questions. Don't do a big, deep, in-depth Bible study, but just ask a couple of questions and get some discussion going. And we have had some amazing testimonies over the years of how God has used that just to really set a flavor, an atmosphere for the rest of the Christmas holiday. It's nice to do that just before the children dive into their gifts and start ripping up packages and flinging paper all over the room. So our story today, there's a guy named Caesar Augustus. He's probably the greatest ruler considered by many people that Rome ever had. And he was really the first big guy that Rome ever had. He was essentially the first emperor. And at the time of our story, he'd been ruling for a while. He was not quite a god at this point, but that was coming as far as the people were concerned. Also, there's a word betrothed, talking about Mary being betrothed to Joseph. And a lot of times in the Western culture, we think of betrothal as basically being engaged, right? You put a ring on it. But it goes way beyond that, because in one of the stories we'll study later, it talks about, when Joseph found out Mary was pregnant, he was going to put her away privately and divorce her. Betrothal, you essentially by law were married. However, you didn't enjoy physical relations with each other, and you didn't live in the same house yet. But unlike in the West today, where you just, I don't want to be engaged anymore, we're broken up. There wasn't a matter of, I just don't want to be betrothed anymore. It took a legal action for that to happen. And by the way, that lasted up in England and America up way through the 1800s. Even during the Civil War, if somebody was engaged and they broke off that engagement, it was a legal action, more than just here's your ring back kind of thing. And I think that's kind of got it. So here is our story from God's word. And it happened in those days that Caesar Augustus issued a decree that all the world be registered. Now, this census took place when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and everyone had to go to their hometown to register. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is also called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the line of David. And he took with him his betrothed wife, Mary, who was pregnant. Now, while they were there, it came time for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son. And she wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there wasn't any room for them in the inn. And there's our story from God's word. Right? So let's kind of walk through this and get you guys to help me. So Caesar Augustus issued a what?
Decree.
Yeah, a decree that everyone should
Go back to their
Be
hometown.
taxed.
Yeah, well, they should be registered. Yeah, it was for the purpose of taxation. Everyone should be registered. And this took place when Quirinius was a what?
Governor of Syria.
Yeah, he was the governor of Syria, and everyone did what?
Went back to their hometown
Yeah, when they went back to their hometown
To
to be registered.
to register, right? And Joseph
Went up.
what?
Oh, he went up.
Yeah, he
From
went
Nazareth.
up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth to Judea to the
City of David,
city of David, yeah, which is also called,
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem.
yeah, because, and why would he go there?
He was of the lineage of David.
Yeah, he was of the house and the line of David. And he went by himself because it was about a 90-mile journey.
No.
Took his real pregnant wife.
It took his betrothed wife who was pregnant. And what happened?
She gave birth.
Yeah, it's interesting the way it phrases it. She gave birth to
A son.
Firstborn son.
her
Firstborn son. Her
firstborn
Mm.
son. It just interesting phraseology, right? And what did she do?
Wrapped him in
Wrapped him in
swaddling cloth.
swaddling cloths.
Swaddling cloths, and
Placed her
in a
in a
manger.
manger.
because
There was no
There's a
room
room
at the
in-
inn.
in the
there wasn't any
restaurant.
room for them in the inn. What do you think it might have been like to have been a person who had, if you're going to move away from your village, you're probably doing it for economic reasons, right? To make a better living someplace. And so you move away from your hometown to go someplace to try to make ends meet. And suddenly this conquering nation that you already hate says, hey, you got to go back to your hometown because we need to know who you are and more about you. What do you think it might have felt like to be somebody in that situation?
Miserable.
Miserable, all right?
Yeah, you gotta travel. You got a pregnant wife, bunch of kids maybe. Your car's got a flat tire or bald tires. I mean, it's just,
I think you're a little jealous of the people that are already home. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah, you count your neighbors, like they don't have to go, they don't have to go. Yeah, they've been here as long as dirt,
Yeah, yeah. What else?
But maybe a little relieved too.
In what way?
You got this pregnant betrothed woman, and there's just only so much gossip a person wants to experience in an
Okay, so
average
you're talking
9 months.
specifically about Joseph then.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. And there might be some other people that just might like to take a
Yeah.
break from
Need
a parent, a spouse.
a change. Yeah. All right. Well, let's look at the first part of this story. So it happened in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And this happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and everyone went to their hometown to register. We'll just kind of stop right there. What do we learn about Caesar Augustus that with just the scrape of a pen or a stylus or a duck quill, he could make the entire known world, put them in upheaval on a whim. I mean, what do we learn about him that he could do that?
He had a lot of power.
Okay, a lot of power. Bev, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say the same thing.
But I bet you would have said it better. But- I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm giving you grief. So that's a lot of power.
No balance of powers. He's not no courts that you can come to and say, that
Yeah.
doesn't seem right to me.
Okay.
He was hard-hearted, I think, to do that as well.
Oh,
To make people
okay.
do that. He wasn't considering them, I don't think. He just wanted what he wanted.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I don't quite get why can't we just take an in-place census? Why we got to go to the hometown for
Yeah.
this to be an accurate count?
Yeah. And we're not told anywhere, right? So it's just like, maybe he had some bad ravioli for breakfast or something. Who knows? But I wonder, do you think he ever thought to himself, there's a God of the universe that is leading me to do this thing? Think that was on his radar anywhere?
No, he think he's God.
Okay. He thinks he is God. Not God making me do this because I'm God, so I am doing it.
Or there might be some gods that are going, you're doing a great job there. Love it.
Okay, all right.
Be sure to, bring some extra stuff. No problem. I'll bring it for the next offerings.
Well, what do we learn about God that he can influence a man who has so much power to fulfill his will? What do you see there?
Even
Even
power.
more
You even more powerful. Okay. Yeah. I mean, what else?
God is not intimidated either, I think.
Yeah, he doesn't seem overly impressed with Caesar Augustus, right? Like he reaches in his toolbox for the tool he needs for the moment, and it just happens to be Caesar Augustus.
You look at Caesar here, and I know that travel is expensive, no matter how you do it. If you're just sitting on the Donkey Express while you're going, you're still going to buy water or buy Coke, whatever, get bored, have to do something. So this is also a way for him to generate some economy in his kingdom, I think.
Okay. All right. So,
But he's losing all that work that people would be doing unless he's timed it to be in an agrarian society during the off time, meaning during the more dormant time of the fields. You kind of risk losing some revenue by imposing a mandate.
yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the farmers and those kind of things. So we mentioned that Caesar was kind of mean, that he was kind of selfish because he didn't think those things, he didn't take those things into consideration, right? Is that we all kind of in agreement on that? But who led Caesar to do this? I mean,
God did. Yeah.
does it seem like God is going to a lot of trouble to get his son born in Bethlehem? Well, probably should have mentioned in the introduction, there was a prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. All right. And so, I mean, what do you see here as far as God moving some pieces around to get his son in the right place? We said that Caesar was mean for doing this.
I think it's interesting that for us, us, I mean, Christian, we think it's a God is moving peace, like God is influencing Caesars. But to Caesar, he's probably think like Diane said, he just wanted more tax. He's
Yeah.
greed driven, but yet God still used such an evil, not well, a bad intention.
Yeah, yeah, okay, so God used something he was doing anyway, right?
It's interesting because God could have just been like, "Hey Joseph, hey Mary, go take a trip to Bethlehem."
Yeah, I mean, we see in Matthew that God spoke in dreams a number of times, right?
When they had a week for Egypt, he's like, "Hey, go to Egypt."
Yeah, or maybe a burning bush with a sign and fire, go to Bethlehem. But God didn't do that. I mean, did God, in essence, discomfort the entire known world?
This is an interesting thing. One of the things is that now Joseph is forced to go to Bethlehem.
Hmm.
Okay, it's not like I'm going to get my wife away from this gossip by going to Bethlehem. He's forced to do it. Okay, so now no one can gossip about his decision to do it.
Okay,
So,
all right. So yeah, it's
whether,
not.
whether God is inconveniencing the world or not, I mean, it seems to us that it's rather inconvenient what he's doing. Okay. What does God think about it, though? He's fulfilling the prophecies from 700 years before, 800 years before, whatever. Joseph, known as a God-fearing man, must have known the prophecy out of Micah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and so if he'd known, he could have gone, "Hey, babe, we need to go to Bethlehem," right?
Yeah,
He's like,
I think God's very efficient. And who knows what other stuff God did through that census. He's like, well, while I'm at it, I'm going to put my son there. But I got this couple over here in Capernaum. I'm going to do something for them. I've got, who knows what all God took advantage of in that one event. This is the one we know about.
Yeah, yeah. Sarah, what were you going to say?
Maybe Joseph didn't want to like force the prophecy, like, oh, I could go there, but then it's just me making things happen.
Oh, okay. Like, yeah, this needs to happen on God's timetable, right? Well, that second part of the story, that second verse of the story there, where it talks about Quirinius being the governor of Syria when this happened, right? So by putting such a specific detail in the story, people who were initially hearing this story, because this was obviously shared verbally before it was written down, would there have been people at that time that would have known whether that was true or not?
Oh yeah, I remember making that myself.
So I wonder, what might we learn about the Holy Spirit that he would insert that kind of, I mean, that's a pretty intricate detail, right? Something specific. So what do we learn about the Holy Spirit that he would add that kind of information to a story?
I think it validates the truth of the timing and helps us understand the timing and the truth of what's going on. They're not making things up.
Yeah.
I think it also says that some time has elapsed since this census.
Okay.
Because at the time of the census, all you'd have to say was, oh, you remember that census? Maybe there's been another census since then. So it's like, oh, remember that census? Yeah, that was the one when Quirinius was governing. Like, oh, yeah, I remember that. That was the worst.
Yeah.
Or that was a lot better than the one we had to do back, when I was a teenager.
Well, it says that everybody left from their hometown to go register. And Andrew and I were talking about this earlier before you guys joined us. What do you think? Do you think most people in that time and in that place and culture, you think they did a lot of traveling, or do you think most people were born, raised, lived, and died pretty much in the same, in the same place? What do you think?
I think it's not that convenient. So people just stay, right? Your father is the farmer, you will be the farmer too. You will not become engineer. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Although even 90 miles to Nazareth to Bethlehem is not that far. Even in old agrarian times, it's not a prohibitive distance. It's a week's walk. So, say 20 miles. I was born in a tiny little town, a stone's throw from New York City. So if I was still there, I'd probably be working or living in New York City. So to go back to my hometown would not be that difficult.
Yeah.
This particular trip, it seems to be more difficult because you got a pregnant wife.
Yeah, well, let's move on to the next part of the story. So Joseph went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is also called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the line of David. And he took with him his betrothed wife, who was pregnant. And while they were there, it came time for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there wasn't any room for them in the inn. So what do we learn about David? That he's going to Bethlehem because he's a king.
Huh?
Right? I mean, he's in the line of the king. David was the king, so he's royal blood. What do you learn about Joseph from the fact that he's what do we learn about the line of David?
It doesn't seem
What?
very spectacular anymore.
What was that? I couldn't quite make that out, Sarah.
It doesn't seem very spectacular anymore. Like he's just like an ordinary guy.
Okay, yeah, like
I don't
he's
think
not.
anyone's like, oh, you're an heir to the throne. No one's like, oh, Joseph is here.
Yeah, the BBC is not going to do a special. Oprah Winfrey's not interviewing him, for a special broadcast.
And I think what you mentioned earlier is it's possible that people only move because of other places are better, looking for a better financial prospect. So the fact that he moved out of Bethlehem,
Oh yeah,
that's a possibility. And then also that, yeah, like Sarah said, nobody cares that he's from the lineage of David. So it doesn't seem too cool to be line of David anyway.
It's not, back to the distance thing. This is not a daunting distance because every year they go up for the Passover, and they actually have to go slightly farther, for the Passover because,
yeah, that's a good point.
Bethlehem's right outside, so it's a familiar. It's like, oh, never been this way before. Route 66, and it's familiar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, Diane. So this would have been as for men anyway.
Yeah.
But because it was by law that men, if they were able to make that journey, would need to make the journey. Well, the fact he took his wife, right? Now, do you think the law would have required women to go? I mean, based on what we know of women from other stories in this culture.
Yeah, who the heck cares where they go?
They don't even count.
Yeah, and I'm going to be very careful what I say here because I'm obviously outnumbered in this call. So if I say something rude, I will just say, I heard Andrew say. So
I have 4 daughters. I got 4 daughters and a wife. So.
My husband likes to watch Gutfeld. This is a confession. And Gutfeld is like, after he says something, and he said, a sexist would say, meaning,
okay,
not me.
okay. Yeah, I don't know who that is. So
Yeah, it's just this guy, and he'll tell if he thinks his joke's a little bit, then there's a little
okay.
pause, and then he says, a sexist. would
Yeah,
say.
okay. Oh, I have to remember that. Well, if he didn't have to take Mary, I mean, would it seem a very smart thing to do? I mean, does it seem she's a little pregnant or a lot pregnant?
A lot. She's about to give birth.
Huh.
Well, I think John the Baptist had been born or just a chapter earlier. So she's at least 6 months pregnant. And I think a pregnancy lasts 9 months. That's what my wife says. So yeah,
She has
she's
4 daughters.
yeah, she's fairly pregnant. That he would take her. But she, her pregnancy was a special pregnancy. Not done during a wedding, she's not even married yet, and she's 6 months pregnant. So for Joseph to take her, being a just and responsible man, shows just how nice a guy he really is.
Well, but let's talk about that for a second. So he might be just and nice, but he doesn't seem very smart if he's taking at least, I would say, at least an 8-month pregnant woman, right? I'm going to go beyond the 6 month. Because if it takes them a week or 2 weeks to get there, she gets there, she gives birth. So he might be loving and he might be kind, but he's not too bright.
Well, if his wife has to stay where she's not married and going to give birth, that is not going to be the ideal situation to put your wife through if you want to have a happy marriage the rest of your 40 years on the earth. So taking his wife with him is going to stop a lot of problems before they happen.
Well, could that tell us anything about the relationship she has with her family? Her family's the one that's from Nazareth. All right. So do we learn anything potentially, possibly, about what it's like for her there at Nazareth to be a betrothed wife who is very pregnant? What do you guys see?
Well, I think it shows trust on the part of her family, that they trust that he's going to treat her well on this trip, that he's not going to abandon her, that they're willing to let her be out of their sight with this man. Says they think he's gonna treat her well in this other place.
Either that, or they've already been like, we're not the biggest fans of your choices, that you're pregnant, and maybe we don't believe you.
Yeah,
and
so
well, it's got a closer relationship with Joseph already because of that. So like Elizabeth received her gladly, but maybe not the rest.
Yeah, and Sarah, you bring up a really good point. Maybe they don't believe her. So let's look at that for a second. Anybody you know, regardless of how godly they are, if they told you they were pregnant, but they had never had sex, right? Is there anybody you know or have ever met that you would believe that if they told you that?
I believe my wife.
Yeah, good answer. Good answer.
But apart from that, I'd have a hard time believing anybody else. But I think Joseph had a lot of confidence in his family.
Well, hold on to that. I want to talk about that in a second. We're going to his family, but we haven't left her family yet.
Okay. And
so
I don't think he cared what her family thought.
In a high honor shame culture, all right, what might have been the result of her being 8 months pregnant and not legally married yet. When I say legally, to the point where you all can share the same house officially. Boy, not an awkward conversation as a guy to have in a Zoom room full of women. But
I think it depends on what people think. There've been lots and lots of oops babies through the years. And very often, if the couple involved go ahead and do the right thing, people remember, but after a few years, it's kind of not a big deal. Because it's like, oops, they jumped the gun, but
okay,
so at that moment, but it's not like this is a societies, even with that high level, what they don't like is if the guy won't come forward. So there's a guy that's come forward for any number of people might guess, since he, there's just some.
well, you bring that up, so they're betrothed. They're not married yet. Could Joseph have gone ahead and married her before this?
How long do betrothals usually, like how long would they last?
We can guess with some of those things, but it's a total guess, right? But if somebody's pregnant, you would think most cultures, they're going to push that along, right?
But I think that they were following God in that, because if they did get married, then they'd say, oh, Jesus wasn't, she wasn't really a virgin, so that would kind of ruin the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think he was following what God told him to do. I think
Oh,
when the angel said,
okay.
it's okay, don't worry. And I think he knew he wasn't supposed to, because this was special. It's not an ordinary baby.
Yes. Yeah. And we are told in the Matthew passage, which we'll look at in a few weeks, they did not know each other until after Jesus was born. So God very much protected.
And God chose a man that he could trust too. I think
Yeah.
Joseph isn't an ordinary, Mary and Joseph, God trusted both of them
Oh, yeah, in a huge way.
to follow his, to follow what he was wanted to obey God, and was willing to, even though he was ready to do the opposite. But when God told him, and then he obeyed God.
Well, Andrew mentioned, now that he's out of the room, we can talk about it. Andrew mentioned.
Yo estoy escuchando.
So-
Oh, I'm listening. I'm sorry.
Andrew mentioned Joseph's family. So there's a lot of moving around, right? People go into their hometowns, and there's no room in the inn, is what the story says, right? So is that surprising that a lot of inns are filled up with, travelers who have moved away coming back to register? He's from Bethlehem, right? Would it seem like he would have family members there? Now, are their houses likely to be full?
Yes.
But let me ask you a question. If you had a house full of people and a woman came in who was 9 months pregnant, who had walked 90 miles, because is there a donkey in our story anywhere?
No.
Yeah. For a family that had to make an offering of a turtle dove because they couldn't afford a lamb, is it very likely they would have owned a middle-class method of transportation?
Is that what it is? The donkey is a middle class-ish.
But it would have been fairly expensive for somebody as poor as they were.
Okay.
Unless you got a loan, but then you gotta pay for the feed all along the way.
Yeah.
Maybe Elizabeth was like, here, take a donkey. I bought one
Yeah,
for you.
And I would challenge you, one of the things that just drives me nuts. If this is my hobby horse. Christmas time, most of our Christmas theology comes from Christmas carols and not from the Bible. And we just know there are certain things that are true about Christmas, and yet they are nowhere stated in Scripture. But we sing about them so much they become truth in our minds, right? And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about the wise guys.
Wait, you just told me there's no donkey? What?
Yeah, sorry. I hate to ruin every Christmas cartoon that has ever been made.
And my Christmas cards, I can't send them now.
I've seen one illustration and there's no donkey. It's a couple hundred years old, but still
Yeah.
there is one.
Yeah, there's not a lot of those. But so we've got these families, if his family is there, I mean, if they had kids staying someplace, would they push them outside so that the pregnant woman could have a space? So what might we learn about Joseph's family from the fact there was no room for Mary in his family's houses?
Could the family has been farther away from when they were traveling and they just were tired right then and didn't want to keep walking? I mean, I don't know how big Bethlehem was.
Bethlehem is a tiny little village.
Okay, never mind that.
As a matter of fact, we can figure, in a couple of years when Herod sends the soldiers in to kill the children, there were probably about 30 children 2 and under in that village. It was that small, right? So a relatively, at that time, tiny place. Well, still it's pretty tiny.
So
Maybe they got lost.
here's where I just might be a little naughty and say that I have heard that word that is translated in could just as easily be translated guest room or room that would go to guests in a home.
Yeah, there's some, and honestly, at that time, but during the life of Jesus, don't know about yet, but in just a few years, it was very common in Jewish home, because the festivals, people were this is not unusual for people to travel, right? Like you mentioned the religious festivals, Diane. People would put a carpet out on like their porch or their front, and people go, oh, they have space. And then when they ran out of space, they would take that up. But if you've got a 9-month pregnant woman, okay, if you are not making accommodation for her as a extended family member, what might that tell us about Joseph's family and their view of Mary and Joseph?
Well, maybe the girl doesn't rate a place in the guest room, and she rates a place elsewhere in the family property.
Okay, all right.
And
you were about to jump in?
Well, when you said that, I mean, they perhaps were one of those people criticizing them and didn't want anything to do with her because they thought that, they really had sex before, before. And so they like, stay away from us. They were perhaps shunning them and like, don't stay here. We don't want anyone to know you're part of our family or whatever. They might have really been judging them, perhaps.
What do some of the rest of you see there?
I was thinking maybe Joseph, because there were no telephones and he didn't know if they would accept her or not. Maybe he just didn't want to risk that. And maybe he didn't even ask, his family members, because he figured they're going to think, bad of us and her. And so maybe he just didn't try to get in with these relatives that he probably hadn't seen in a long time.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You make me think, Cheryl, because they did end up renting a house there and staying for a couple of years. Right? In Bethlehem. So, because we'll talk about that next week, because when the wise guys get there, they're in a house. They're living in a house. So the fact that they ended up staying there, that they have that kind of, we're not told why or any of that, but I mean, in a high honor shame culture, and as I was doing this story in China this morning, they had a really clear picture of what this might look like. But because especially in the rural areas, that's just not, no, you just don't do that, right? So what do we learn? I mean, do we see Joseph trying to protect Mary in this whole thing? What do you guys see there? I mean, what do you learn about Joseph from the fact that he took Mary, he gets it? I mean, what do you see? I'm curious as to your gut reaction to Joseph through all this.
I feel like he really wanted to be there with Mary and like make sure she wasn't left alone in Nazareth, but he brought her with him so that he could be there for the birth. If anything were to happen, he was there. Yeah, I feel like he's protecting her. He's, looking for a place for them to stay.
Okay, all right. So somebody else, what do you have? I'm curious, especially for you ladies, to get your take on this guy, because as far as I'm concerned, this is one of the greatest heroes in all the Bible, and it just, we just don't talk about him much.
I think he take this job very serious, that this is God's son, and he want to make sure he is present at the moment.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to miss any chance that Mary will have baby somewhere.
Okay.
Also to show that he really take this as honor, I think. And he want to do whatever he can to protect Mary and the baby. They are safe and nothing go wrong, out of control or anything.
Okay, so he wants to fully fulfill what God's called him to. Oh, I like that.
I think it shows he loves her too. That
Okay.
he want her to be with him in what they're doing, I think. And the idea of protecting too is part of, I think, how much he loved her, I think.
Oh. Yeah.
And then God, to like someone else said, how seriously he took it. It shows his love for God too, I think.
Oh, love for her and love for God. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe I can kind of see, I don't know, but I can kind of see a discussion between them him coming home. Hey, you know what? There's a new tax and I have to go to Bethlehem, and her saying, okay, so let's go, and we'll have to go. And he's going, you can't go. And then her saying, I have, but then it could have been like together. She insisted and he realized it was the best option. I mean, we don't really know how that went, but it was a good thing.
I also see that he or both of them are really stuck in a place between like a rock and a hard place. Like either staying, but like staying or going to find relatives, or staying by themselves. Like none of these are the ideal situation, but they are still trying to make the best out of. And I must wonder, like they must be thinking, like, if this is God, why are both of these choices sucks?
Well, but what does that teach us about God? That he put them in, I mean, in some ways, a lose-lose situation, right?
She's young and healthy, we think. And, sometimes there's often consideration she's a teenager. Some of this might just roll, it's like, whoop. We're coming up with how hard it is and everything, and the gossip and other things. And Mary could have just been like, whatever. Teenagers sometimes are just like, their parents are all worried about everything, and the kid's just fine.
Diane, I would see that in our culture, but I wonder in a culture that is so highly honor shame as the culture there would have been. What do you guys think the odds of that happening?
Can I tell you about a young lady I know? And she's from a background where honor and shame is very high. It was a student I had the year I retired. And she came and she was living with friends of our family, made arrangements for her to stay with this other family. And they had a son who was similar to her in age. They were in their 20s, and he showed her around the city, and the family was really nice. And then I find out that they're engaged. I'm like, oh, that's great. And she was having a little problem with her health. She passed out. She passed out once while I was holding on to her. And but the second time we find out, it's she tells me she's pregnant. And so we get the number and we call her fiance. And I have this picture of him. Our classroom was at the end of the hall, and I see him. I'm waiting outside of the room because at that point there were a couple of other people in the room with her. We actually had a couple of nurses that were in other classes. And I see him running down the hall, down the hall to where she is. And I didn't see, I think that they were betrothed in a sense. And so this crossing that boundary a little earlier, she's like, Diane, it's okay. That there is, there's shame. And yet at the same time, even in a culture like that, if you've got a way to mediate, right? They were going to go forward. They're happy. Little child's now 3 or 4. That people are going to remember, but you're just on a list that they check it off.
Okay.
Right. You were one of the ones that did that.
Yeah.
So I'm not positive it's that, like, oh, yeah.
Yeah. I just think back in those times, the penalty for those things was fairly severe. Yeah. Although they didn't do it a whole lot at that point, although it still was done, as we see during the time of Jesus. But we talked a little bit about the fact that God kind of moved Caesar Augustus to fulfill his will, that he inconvenienced people. And then we talked about, Mary and Joseph, Vivian, he put Mary and Joseph between a rock and a hard place, right? That it's whether they stayed in Nazareth or went to Bethlehem, there's going to be some negative things there. So we see that God was willing to put people in uncomfortable, I'll use that word, uncomfortable situations to fulfill his will. Does that kind of, does he still do that today? Is that still ongoing?
I don't know if you've noticed that we've been in a worldwide epidemic that has inconvenienced a lot of people.
I think I read something about that.
Maybe that's passed you by. But yeah, that That happens. There were missionaries stranded in different countries, and not only missionaries, imagine businessmen too, all kinds of people.
Yeah,
And I think how
yeah, go ahead.
like how that is opposite of like they were forced to travel, but then we had travel ban.
Yeah.
We couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah, we're forced to stay. But, you know, it's interesting, Andrew, because you mentioned that, and we have a number of groups that we have worked with, and the missionaries had to leave the country and leave the ministry in the hands of the locals. And in almost every case that I know of where that happened, the ministry thrived.
Yeah. It turns out to be a good thing.
Because as a matter of fact, in one of the situations, I know the Westerners are now going to leave and go to another country and do what they did there and just leave the ministry in the hands of the locals, which is just awesome, right? To see how even you mentioned the pandemic, how God even used that in a positive way. So there are positives even with the negatives. Can you guys think of other ways that God has worked in those kind of scenarios before?
There were a lot of people that at one point were let go at the place where I worked. Not the round that got rid of me, but around probably 5 years earlier. And I saw each of those people get placed in places that were good for them. It's been a little harder in this round, but in that round, I was praying for all those people as they transitioned, and some were believers and some weren't, but they were like, yeah, that's a good place for you. And some of them are still in those same work positions, but they were all just let go.
Yeah.
And over a period, it was very retching for us where we were, because it all happened over about a year.
Oof.
Over kind of a contract cycle.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
It's uncomfortable today with things going on in terms of the transgender and all that, where Christians are uncomfortable to speak the truth because we get hated for what we believe. So that's one way it's happening today.
Yeah, it is. I was actually reading about some of those things this morning or earlier on, and that's going to be something we're going to have to deal with. For as right now, for a lot of us, it's kind of on the periphery, but at some point, it's going to be an issue until the world wakes up. And I think at some point the world is going to wake up and realize the emperor has no clothes. Because it's just it is such at its essence, that belief is so silly that this could ever be normative. But it's really interesting because what's going on in Europe right now is there's a backlash against the transgender movement. But because there are people going, wait a minute, I just read this morning, there was the person that won the NCAA women's swimming event or some swimming event someplace was competing on the men's team last year.
For the last several years.
Yeah. But
he has long hair now.
But it's recent, like you're going.
And I've seen the picture of this man, and your hair is long.
You're going. Does anybody else see that this is, there's certain things that you just, you just, and I think there's a spiritual heart to all that people are blinded to what for many of us would seem to be obvious truth. Now, how we respond, Bev, one of the things you brought up is we need to respond in a Christ-like way to disagree while still loving. And I think the church has done a pretty horrific job of that, of disagreeing with people that we might have strong biblical beliefs is no, that's not the right thing you need to do, but doing it in such a way that they realize they're still loved. So, well, what in this story do you see that could help you in the future? I mean, what just anything jump out at you? Yeah, Cheryl?
Well, I think that if you have trials, I guess we should realize it doesn't mean that we're not doing what God wants. You know, sometimes we think, well, it's just not going well, it's too hard, it must not be God's will, but maybe
Yeah.
it's just there's something God's doing in the middle of that in preparation or whatever for future. So we need to realize sometimes in God's path, there are difficult hurdles.
Wow, that's a great point. And one I think the church in America really needs to hear, because exactly what I've heard young people tell me, well, if this was God's will, it wouldn't be so hard. You know, and I'm going,
Right.
what is your scripture for that?
I remember when we were getting on the mission field, we went through some tough things. And we just felt like later looking back thinking, well, I guess God wanted to see if we really were gonna really be missionaries and persevere. And
Yeah.
we had to get over that hurdle, and then things kind of smoothed out. But it was a difficult. And we had some friends that they got married and they were gonna go down to Mexico and do missions. And they kept trying to cross the border with a whole ton of stuff that they wanted to put in their house. And they got rejected about 3 times, and they decided, well, it must not be God's will. And they decided not to be missionaries in Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was just gonna say. When you hit those obstacles, then you're like, oh, maybe this is God telling me no. Like Mary and Joseph could have been like, oh, there's no room, and then maybe we should have never come here. Maybe God didn't want us to actually come. And you can start doubting those things. You're like, oh, well, there's obstacles, so that's God telling us no.
One time, my wife and I were going to go on a 5-hour drive to visit some friends on the coast from Mexico, here in Mexico. We had 6 flat tires on the way. And after the last one, and nobody wanted to fix my tire that night, we decided, you know what? We're just going to spend the night in a hotel, get the tire fixed in the morning, and head back. So sometimes those things might just be God's will.
That's true.
And not letting you get
You
there.
just have to have that communication.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, who gets 6 flat tires?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've had 6 flat tires in my lifetime. So that's.
I mean, we're not talking trashy bald tires. We're talking maybe one was, but 6.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that, because I had a picture in my mind of the Clampetts, Model T with cloth tied around the hole. So
We
well,
didn't
this
even go
story,
100 miles the whole
And-
day. We did 100 miles. It was just one.
I think also don't assume that we look on it at the outside and it looks like hardship. Maybe Mary and Joseph had a ball on that trip, got to know each other. He finds out she's got a wonderful sense of humor. He does things for her that bring them together and help them to bond. They might have looked back later. Remember that night we stayed at the such and such, or when we ran into those people, I thought that woman would never stop talking. Who knows how many stories that they had from that adventure. Remember the looks remember that one couple when they saw us and saw how pregnant you were? I thought that man was gonna explode. Yeah, and those 2 years, we don't know that those weren't a fabulous time. And we look at the outside. Too often we're quick to say, I bet, Andrew, Cheryl, they're people that they look and they're like, oh, those poor suffering missionaries and tough,
Yeah.
you know, things that they've done. And
Yeah, I've been to Cuernavaca. I don't think that. So this story is in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. And I'm going to stop the recording now so we can, if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.